key presenter of today, which is Dr. Hilmar Bijma. She is working at the Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam, the second largest city here in the Netherlands. And she is also very much interested in research on the impact of maternal psychiatric disease and stress on pregnancy outcomes. So we are very happy that you are welcome, or that you are willing to share your knowledge and results if it comes to reaching out to vulnerable pregnant women. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say I'm very grateful to be here. I'm very inspired by the country reports and by so many people putting an effort into improving the health of pregnant women and their children. Well, as I was introduced, I'm an obstetrician. I'm also very interested in research on healthcare implementation and to bring medical knowledge to community and back. I did not only study medicine, but also anthropology. From there on, I have a deep tendency to grassroots level and then bring grassroots level and top-down level together. So today I'm going to speak about how to reach out to vulnerable pregnant women and their partners and preventing early life stress. We know more and more about fetal development, that early life stress has a severe impact and also a very long-lasting impact. And to turn it around, there's great opportunities in this area. I'd like to check with Melanie if do you see my first slide?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. Thank you. I wasn't sure. So we also developed quite a bit of healthcare implementations. And one of them is Connect to Grow, a project in which we try to reach the most vulnerable, most complicated to say women. We have quite a lot of women with substance abuse, severe psychiatric problems, complex social adversity, childhood trauma. So today I'm going to share a bit about the impact of stress on fetal development and long-term health, which is a kind of a theoretical background, and then I'll share about the project quite briefly, and then I'll take the gems that we got from our project to give some suggestions how you could connect with women in vulnerable situations in your own setting. I'm very aware that Holland is not a low research setting. However, 40% of our children are born in the Dutch, below the Dutch level of poverty. And we do have quite a lot of urban complexity. So, okay, this is the outline of my presentation. First, I'll start with a key message this time so that you kind of know what thing I'd like to bring to you most. Then we'll share a bit on what is toxic early life stress, the impact of early life stress on development, the Dutch example, which is called Connect to Grow, and what can you do in your setting. Some take-home messages and additional sources. I'll just make I made a little overview with internet addresses that you could use. If any would like to reach out, you can ask questions today, but also later on, just email me. I'm very happy to help. So the key message basically is something that was said already quite a while ago by Frederick Douglass, a former slave who had gotten into freedom. It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men, or as I would like to say, to repair broken men or women. And I think that's very true. This knowledge already from 1819. If you put that into more of a scientific perspective, then there's the paradigm of developmental origins of health and disease, which is also called the DOHAT, which basically is also called fetal programming. And basically what that says is that there's an inextricable link, a link that can be broken between maternal, perinatal, and early childhood factors and the risk of developing heart disease, diabetes, obesity, cancer, and many other non-communicable diseases in later life. And that's not something to be pessimistic about. That's something to see as an opportunity in my book. If you then look at toxic early life stress, and I'll come back on toxic stress a bit later on, it derails development, health, and well-being, and not just short-term, long-term. Put it reversely, there are lifelong opportunities to put an effort and invest in this very important early period of life, of the first 1,000 days, or even the pregnancy and the first year. Connection, which in many ways is the opposite of toxic stress, supports resilience, development, health, and well-being lifelong. So this is all about stress and connection. And in some ways, you can frame it as it being the difference between surviving and thriving. The boy on the left is surviving. He's kind of shut off. He's trying to survive and to be with something that his system can't integrate. He is stressed out, not focused on the outside world, not learning. Whereas the two girls on the right side are having fun, relaxed, taking in the world, dancing, celebrating life. For development and health, we need to thrive. Surviving is needed, very often needed, but it's meant to be short-term for your body. Our body is not made to be long-term in survival. So we need to relax. We need to find a place where we can thrive. And sometimes you can't have that all day or all week, but then it might need to be small moments. Even in the worst of conditions, connection makes a difference. So what then is toxic early life stress? I'll first look briefly at stress. Well, the formal definition is basically a non-specific response of the body to any demand. So that might be because of a somatic stressor, a body stressor, or because of a psychological stressor. Basically what happens, something is out of balance. Your body notices and does something to go back to balance. In itself, moderate stress is healthy. That is what supports us in growing. If we would be in our comfort zone, not changing, we wouldn't grow. So the best thing for resilience is basically to have a moderate of stress that you can kind of stretches your nervous system, then you integrate and then you grow. There's also a small drawing image of the APH axis, which is one of our stress systems. It's not the only one. And just to very, very briefly recap, because I think you could also look it up at home, and I don't want to use too much time for that, is that if there's a stress symptom in your body, your hypothalamus gives a signal to the pituitary gland, and that in its turn gives a signal to the adrenal glands, and then the stress system starts. Your stress system impacts many body systems, so that also explains why if you are in stress long term, many body systems are affected. So if you look at stress from this perspective, you can basically see three kinds of stress. There's positive stress. There's a brief increase in heart rate, mild elevations in stress hormone levels. I'm in a positive stress state now. My heart rate speed up because I'm a bit anxious. I want to do it right. But that's good. And it turns back and then I grow. There's also tolerable stress. That's serious temporary stress responses buffered by supportive relationship. There's always stress and there's buffering of stress. And there's toxic stress. Toxic stress basically is stress without relief. Prolonged activation of stress response system in the absence of protective relationships. So the body's just on, or at a certain moment gets shut off, dissociated, disconnected. We have also a little video that briefly explains the concept of toxic stress because it's such a core concept in development. Could you start the video?
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, Where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Great, thank you. I think this is a beautiful, brief introduction. And one of the things why stress for children is different than for adults is that in children, in very young children, in fetuses during pregnancy, in the womb, but also in the early part of life, the stress system is still being set. So the set points and the responsiveness of the stress system is set on very early in life. That means if there is a lot of stress in that specific period, then your stress system basically is set lifelong to be easily stressed, which has a lot of implications. So what is the impact of early life stress on early and long-term development? I will first discuss some of the general impact. So let's look at pregnancy. There's maternal stress, and there's obstetric disease. Prenatal, if there's a lot of prenatal stress, then there's obstetric disease, and the most important ones are preterm delivery and an increased rate of fetal growth restriction. Also, because the child in the womb is exposed to prolonged stress, all the stress systems are, all the organs are shaped and developing in a different way. And during pregnancy, the context of further development is made. The programming takes place during pregnancy. So this is very wide impact on heart, blood vessels. We know, for example, that children with fetal growth restriction already have a more stiff cardiovascular system at 2 years of age. The brain, very important, and I'll go more into detail into that later. The liver and the muscle. So that results in postnatal complications and disease, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, coronary heart disease, neurological disease, a lot of mental health disease, and also metabolic disease, obesity, diabetes type 2, hyperlipidemia. So if we then now take a look on how the stress, the HPA axis is developed, and also how stress impacts the development in the brain, there's three discernments to make. One is epigenetics. That's a whole field of itself, and I won't go in depth into that. But basically, the thing is that if you have DNA, the way DNA is being read and used for transcribing and building a human body and a system is impacted by environment. So which parts of your DNA get switched on or switched off, which parts are used, is under the impact of DNA, under the impact of the environment. A very telling example is the picture, the agouti mice. These mice have similar DNA, but they were growing up in an environment that was different. So there we go to the HPA axis. That's the system that's kind of your basic part of your stress system. I'll take you briefly to it. This image looks a bit complicated, but it's not that difficult. This is the mother. She has a stress system that gets set off by something, and then she gets regulated. In doing so, there's a lot of cortisol being produced. Normally, her stress system gets set off, there's stress, and then it goes down again to relief. If that doesn't happen, that high stress level and high levels of cortisol go to the baby. And then the baby's stress system gets messages that tell it to be set up a bit too responsive. Evolutionary, that makes a lot of sense, that if you are being born in a high stress environment, it makes much sense that your body needs a very sensitive stress system. However, if your mother is stressed, basically in mismatch with the environment, then you get too stressed. Your stress system is too sensitive for life. And that means, for example, that if you're in a classroom and you need to pay attention to mathematics, and you see a bird and your stress system goes off like, oh, but that's something I should pay attention of, you can't focus. So to reduce stress during pregnancy for the pregnant women gives much benefit for the development of the child. One of the things the HPA axis. And there's also infancy, and then mainly the first few months already after delivery. Children can't, it's probably known for most of you, but still I want to summarize it. There's a dyadic regulation. Children can't regulate their own nervous system yet. They biologically can't. That's a mammalian characteristic. So they need a parent to regulate the stress system. The child goes into stress response, cries, the parent goes to stress response, goes to the child, comfort it, and then the child's stress system goes down, and the child learns in conditions that it can endure stress. So emotional connection is massively important for this. The thing that you see moms or dads do with children, interact with them, serve and return, that regulates the stress system. There also is another thing that's really important in this interaction that's called serve and return. The child's brain needs parent to respond. That's how the brain grows. If we then look at emotional disconnection, because a parent can't be available for whatever reason, then the child doesn't get regulated and the stress system just keeps going on and on. And that's usually in a situation where there is a high stress. So availability of a parent during the first few of life is very, very important biologically as well. If I then go on to the brain development, one further, then I want to briefly show to you a bit what happens during pregnancy, during fetal development. Very, very early on in life, the body of the fetus, of the embryo, simply makes neurons. It makes massive amounts of brain cells. They just cell. Then there is in the second part, those neurons migrate and they start branching. And they branch and branch and branch and branch. And then in the third trimester, some audio challenges here. Those cells just make branches, and there's pruning. So basically, the connections that are not used, they disappear. And that's basically, as we know now, lifelong disappearing. So the basic architecture of your brain gets shaped during the last period of your pregnancy and the first period of life. Just to give you a bare fact, just how unimaginably much connections are being made, is 1 million neural connections per second. That's massive. So imagine that there's toxic stress that impacts all those connections. There's a lot of damage. And when there's healthy behavior, there's a lot of gain. Also, on the next slide, brain development has a hierarchical way of being. It starts with the basis, and on that basis, there's one layer foundation, there's another foundation, there's another foundation. It's also being described that in the beginning of life, basically the rooms of the house are being made. And in those rooms are all the connections later on in life, all the ways for learning are being placed. So if your rooms are not made properly at the beginning of life, that impacts and limits basically lifelong your capacity for learning, and learning in a wider sense. Brain development is experience-based. What doesn't get used gets lost. What gets used stays. So if there's neglect, which usually is the most common form of abuse, this is damaging for a brain because those connections aren't being used, and in that stage development, they get lost. Also, stress impacts brain development because it's harder to connect and the brain gets shaped in a different way. This image takes us after birth. So on the left side, there's still the development during pregnancy, as we just discussed. And then to the right side, there's the period of development until 18, 19 years old. And what it shows basically is then after a few months after birth, the basic brain structure is finished, and then you get all the connections. And what we know is that many of those connections get shaped in the first part of life. This red box shows the first 1,000 days of life. So you see that that's a very important period. But within that period, this is the period until the first year of life. Also, this period is even more important. And I want you I want to show you how massively much connections are being made in the first few months after life. So whereas often I think we think about the baby as someone who's developing only gradually after it's being born, biologically we're kind of lagging behind because the first period of development is very important. So the next slide. It's the importance of connection. If we go to the next slide, what makes stress toxic is stress without sufficient buffer. And that's prolonged activation of the stress system in the absence of protective relationships. So in many situations, unfortunately, it's very hard to bring down the stress level because stress often comes from systematic higher order things. You can't change a war if there's a war going on. You can't change poverty. It's hard to change racism. So many stress that's systematic, that's just there. However, what you can change is how we connect and how parents and children connect within those circumstances. We know then in the infant-parent relationship there are two important things. There's buffer, or many, but these two can be discerned. One is that it buffers stress. It's fundamental in buffering stress and helping your body to develop a normal stress system, and from there on, normal long-term health. And also, as I mentioned before, serve and return. Serve and returns, for example, the baby makes a little sound, and the parent looks at the baby and says, "Oh, yes, you're making a little sound." In that way, the baby perceives the world as something that takes notice. What I do matters to the world, something comes back, and because of that interaction, my brain makes a connection. I need symbolic connection to make literal connection in my brain. So the stress buffering is important. If you make a click for the stress axis, and the serve and return is important for the basic brain architecture. And then at the next tick, we see development and health. Obviously, development and health is not only determined by this, but these are two very important ingredients. Next slide. There's another thing that I want to point out, set apart from the biological thing, is that the stress system is not only important in the biological thing or in the body thing in health, but also in who am I? How do I perceive the world? How do I connect with the world? How do I perceive the world? And I call that embodied meaning making. Our brain continuously makes representations of the world around us. We can make that in a more positive and in a more negative or a more fight-flight way. That's very much founded on the body system, on the stress system in the body. And as Deb Dana, a psychotherapist who did much with this, said, the default state of our autonomic nervous system determines our interaction, our meaning making, and perception of all our experiences. So our whole image and concept of what the world is, what people are, what connection is about, what life is about, gets shaped by the underlying stress system. Another way of saying that is that the autonomic nervous system is the foundation upon which our lived experience is built. And life is not just about body somatic health, it's also about how to be human. So if we go to the next slide and we click, then the next question is how to start. How to start a change which improves this for the children and future generation. Well, in Rotterdam, we did it with the Dutch example, Connect to Grow, on the next slide. And what we basically did is that we said, in the Dutch situation, there's a very big there's a big difference because when pregnancy ends and the baby is born, there's a different organization involved. So there's often discontinuity of care, even though we try to make more continuous care. And what we did is that we say, like, okay, already during pregnancy, we can kind of identify the women that are at risk of having trouble with providing good connections of return to their babies and dads. So if we would reach those women and join them and go with them from there on until the first year of life, then we kind of safeguard the first important period. What's important to notice is these people often also have trouble connecting with care providers, have connecting with people in the community, because their basic, sometimes if trauma is an issue, the basic capacity to connect themselves is damaged, wounded. These are often wounded people. We also buffer stress with serve and return. So what we basically do in the project is that we reach out and we model basically what a parent would model for a baby. And we hope by providing safety and showing and modeling that in such a context that parents find more space to take up that for themselves. More professionally seen, we kind of monitor it also formally, the parent-infant relationship. We try to take away the stress by social support, but we also look at the real interaction, and if that's worrisome, we provide specific interventions. So we basically journey together. What then can you do in your setting? Well, there's a lot. And what's very important is who you are and how you make connection. If you could click on the next thing. It's people and not programs that change people. This is a saying from Bruce Perry, an American child and youth psychiatrist who has created great programs, very nationwide programs, basically for supporting children in trauma and reducing stress. And I think these are very wise words. Change doesn't come from programs. You have to do it with people. So what can you do in your setting? Once again, we look at buffering stress and we look at serve and return. This is not, this is some of the ingredients, but it's many more than this also. You can use trauma-sensitive communication. There's several ways to do that, but being transparent, being clear, being predictable, actively providing safety, that usually makes it much easier to connect with people who are in chronic stress state. Authenticity and presencing, and with that I mean, in a way, simply being with somebody and meeting somebody in where he or she is. Because that's the first thing. You first have to meet someone where he or she is before you can support someone to move to a different place. Also beautiful is open curiosity. Open curiosity is basically a kind of a childlike wonder. You're looking like, okay, what's happening here without judgment, because what happens if somebody else is stressed, you get stressed as a care provider. And if you then get an interaction of stress, 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 you don't get anywhere. So try to take a distant stance and look like, hey, oh, what's happening? Fostering connection, actively foster connection between you and the family, between the woman and the partner, between the parents and the children. Include and create the narrative. Peoples are shaped by their history, and understanding a bit more about where somebody comes from usually makes it very much easier to understand if somebody is stressed out or has trouble with connecting. And think of the brain, like put on your brain glasses and see the importance, have an awareness on the importance of connection for both the brain and the stress system. Next slide. So what can you do if you are talking about serve and return? Well, the serve is basically, if you transpose that to an adult setting, is a listening to the future parents. And I said deep listening. With deep listening, I mean like really not just formally hearing the words, but hearing what is between the words. Being with them, hearing what they say, what they need. And then the return is kind of mentalization. Mentalization is the capacity to see that somebody else has different needs and different desires than you have yourself. And that's a very important thing, to be able to connect to your baby. Because if you think the baby is the same as you, then you are unable to see what your child needs. It's a very important thing, and it's something that gets lost a bit if people are stressed out or have had a lot of trauma. Support self-regulation, because you can only support somebody else in regulation if you're regulated yourself. Support self-efficacy, empowering, providing experiences of success and not of failure. Lower stress if possible, and empower. Next slide, please. So that brings me to the take-home messages. Toxic early life stress, so not only healthy stress, but toxic early life stress derails development before and after birth and has long-term implications. Promote connection and promote the serve and return, and help parents in doing that. And sometimes it just takes a little example, just a little spark to show parents like, oh, you could do also this. The Dutch example I shared with you is Connect to Grow. And most importantly, you can start now, well, tomorrow. In some countries, it's already quite late. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of some of the additional sources that are available for you if you would want to look up more. And then please, the last slide. Well, okay, there was a slide with thank you and questions, and below there's my email address. If you would want to know more, reach out, want me to make suggestions for you, please let me know.
Interesting presentation, and on this very important, I think, universe topic. And I think it's also nice that you shared tools for everyone all over the world. What can we do, at least, to intervene as far as possible? We have only 4 minutes left for some Q&A at this moment, but luckily you also shared your email address so people can contact you, so that's another possibility. And all the presentations will be available, so also the sources you shared with us, people can watch later. But just 2 questions maybe,
Yes.
and maybe just short answers.
Yes, I have 2 questions. The first question is, this new concept of toxic stress is developing, but also opponents of the theory are active. We notice it in the Netherlands. And what is your experience with this? And what about your professional colleagues?
Well, I think any concept, nothing is black and white. And to explain this concept, sometimes we use quite black and white language. So it makes only sense to me that people would want to put different perspectives to that. So I think that's important. There's no one truth. There's multiple perspectives always. I think it's also hard to acknowledge the concept of stress because it asks for quite a fundamental different approach of health and healthcare, which is not so much technocratic, but much more human-based. So I think that might make it challenging because it kind of challenges our paradigms. It asks for a paradigm shift in medicine.
Yes, I agree. And I think buffering stress, you notice in the normal life that helps. And the second question. Do we need in an MCH handbook any pages about stress, to prevent stress? In traditional culture, there may be big stress for women who live together with parents-in-law and the relatives. Do we need to give more information about stress and how to prevent it?
Thank you for the question. I much appreciate it. I think it's an important one. I think preventing stress has not gained as much as attention as some of the other forms of health prevention, but I think this one deserves much attention. So my preference would be, I think it would be great if we could add pages on stress and stress prevention, just some basics, just to acknowledge and to prime people like, okay, this is an important thing as well.
Okay, thank you. We have work to do, I think, in all the countries, even in the Netherlands.
Even in the Netherlands, especially in the Netherlands.
Yes. No, I think that was the last question for you. And I think we go on for the program.
Yeah, I think once again, thank you very much for your presentation and sharing your experience and knowledge.